Hi guys, hopefully this is working. This is a brief lesson as an overview to the classical period. Hopefully by now you've done all of the provisional tasks that I've set via Edmodo, including the focus on sound activities. If you have, this will hopefully make sense and it will just extend your knowledge a little bit. It is important that you take notes because I would be asking you to do that if we were in school. So if you don't have something to write with, go and grab some paper or a pen, whatever you need, and get started. But we're going to crack on now anyway. So obviously the first thing to note is that the classical period followed on from the Baroque period. And whilst you can read all sorts of different books and they'll give you different dates, we're going to go by these dates. So if we imagine, or if we remember that the Baroque period, we say ended in 1750 with the death of composers like Bach. This is then the beginning of the classical period, and we normally say that it goes until the early 1800s. So for now, just stick with 1820. It seems to be a good year to go with. Okay. Just a note to say though, people obviously didn't wake up in 1750, January 1st, and they didn't go, wow, I'm in the classical period. But it's a way for us to sort of classify time and traditions and cultural trends. But anyway, have that down if you haven't got it already. And then those three dudes there, these are some key composers. You may recognize them. Hopefully you recognize at least one of them. But right on the left there, we have Haydn. In the middle, we've got Mozart. And on the end there, we've got Beethoven. And actually, they're nicely in order in terms of chronology. So Haydn was sort of around a bit before Mozart. There was an overlap with Mozart. And then Beethoven came around as well. So these three are sort of like the holy trinity of the classical period, and you really should know these three composers in terms of classical music. Of course, there are plenty of others, but these are the three most well-known composers. In terms of musical structures, by now you should be pretty familiar with these, and one in particular, which I'll mention in a moment. But common structures include binary form, ternary form, rondo form, theme and variation, which isn't something we've discussed yet, and sonata form. And the reason I've got that in bold, underlined with an asterisk is a couple of reasons. Number one, it was super important in the classical period. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. Number two, you have, or you should have completed a lesson on this already. And number three, the word sonata means two different things in this context. So here we're talking about a musical form, so a type of structure, but sonatas are also a type of genre, a type of music. Okay, so be careful when we use that word sonata, but we'll be going into more depth again when we look at some specific pieces. In terms of genres then, there are lots of genres which continued over from the Baroque period, and then some new ones that popped up as well. So these include the sonata, that's again already a familiar word, chamber music, which includes things like trios, quartets, and quintets. That literally relates to the number of people that are playing. So in a trio, there are 3 people. In a quintet, there are 5 people. The concerto, I've called it the classical concerto here, but very similar to the Baroque concerto. It's just in the classical period. The symphony, this is something new. Operas and oratorios still continued, but obviously they were stylistically quite different from the Baroque period. So make sure you've got a list of these key genres. If you need to, you can pause the video whilst you get those down. And what we're going to do is actually spend a very little bit of time on key genres from the classical period. So the first one we're going to talk about is the sonata. Now, I've already mentioned sonata form, which is a type of structure. And again, if you've covered that lesson already, you'll remember there's an exposition, development, recapitulation, and all that jazz. But in this sense, we're talking about the genre of a type of music. Now, a sonata is a solo instrument work. Okay, so you might have a sonata for just piano, or you might have a sonata for an instrument such as flute, and it's accompanied by piano. So it's essentially a piece for solo instrument, but if it's not a piano, it tends to have piano accompaniment. There tends to be 3 or 4 movements. So remember, a movement is like a whole piece of music in itself, a chunk of music, and they tend to relate to each other, but there's always a plan in terms of tempo. So for example, the first movement tends to be quite fast, so allegro, and it actually tends to be in sonata form. The second movement tends to be slower. The third movement tends to be in triple meter, and the fourth movement tends to be very fast. So that's a sort of basic plan of a sonata. What I've got here is an example of a very famous movement from one of Beethoven's sonatas. I'm just going to play you a short extract now. Hopefully it will sound okay. I'm going to pause that there, but hopefully you recognize that piece. It's very famous, but that's a very good example of a piano sonata, so a piece for solo instrument from the classical era. Moving on, the string quartet is, you may guess, a piece of music written for string instruments, and there are 4 of them. There are 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. So notice that in a string quartet, you don't have a double bass. It's not one of each. It's 2 violins, 1 viola and 1 cello. And again, this is like a sonata. It follows a very similar structure, but for the 4 string players. Again, it uses sonata form in the first movement, just like in a solo sonata. And there are 4 movements. I'm going to play you a short extract from a quartet by Haydn. I'm going to stop that there again, and hopefully you can hear the difference in that each part, there's only 1 player on each part, whereas opposed to an orchestra, you would have multiple string players, so multiple violinists playing 1 part, multiple cellists playing their part, etc. I wanted to show you this to make you laugh. So this was my quartet back in Cambridge. I'm actually here now. Sadly, most of these guys aren't around anymore. Look how youthful I am here. And this will make you really laugh. This was my first quartet when I was your age. There you go. I'm cringing as I show you this, but I thought it would make you laugh. Moving on quickly. So we've already talked about concertos in the Baroque period, and you may remember that we have concerto grossos and solo concertos. If you do remember that, all you need to know really for the classical period is we got rid of the concerto grossos. So essentially we just had solo concertos. And again, just like in the Baroque period, we have an orchestra and then a solo instrument. So the soloist could be a violinist, a flautist, a bassoon player, a pianist even. Okay, so obviously we're not going to have any Baroque concertos with piano because it wasn't around. Just like in the Baroque period, there are 3 movements and they follow the same tempo plan. So fast, slow, fast. And yes, you could have guessed it, they use sonata form typically in the first movement. What's different about the classical concerto in comparison to the Baroque concerto is it uses something called a cadenza. Okay, so a cadenza is basically a solo bit where the soloist shows off. The orchestra tend to stop playing and the soloist goes a bit crazy. And this is before the coda, which is like the tail end section. I'm going to play you a little bit from Mozart's Clarinet Concerto. In fact, I'm going to play you 2 short extracts from it. This is the very beginning. So I'm going to pause it there. And the reason I wanted to play that much initially is because you might be thinking, well, actually, I can just hear the whole orchestra playing, which is true. Normally in a concerto, you start by having an orchestral introduction before you then introduce the soloist. And as it's called a clarinet concerto, you're expecting to hear a melody played by the clarinetist. Let's move on a little bit. Okay, hopefully there you heard the same melody that was played in the introduction by the orchestra, then played as a solo, accompanied by the orchestra. So the solo was obviously then played by the clarinet. Okay, so be careful not to assume that a piece is an orchestral piece, a full orchestral piece, until you've heard the soloist. So this is where you might get confused, because we have something called a symphony, which the word literally means sounding together. And this is where you have a full orchestra. So it's, again, like a sonata, but we have the whole orchestra playing. Typically, there are 4 movements, and they follow the similar plan. The third movement tends to be what we call a minuet and trio, which is, again, type of dance in 3/4. But you've got to be mindful that actually, when you're listening to parts of concerto or parts of a symphony, they can sound very similar. The difference is, on the whole, the symphony is everyone together, whereas a concerto is a soloist with the orchestra accompanying. Let's have a listen to some of Mozart's 40th Symphony. I'm going to stop that there. It's a good piece. Definitely check it out. Okay, so 2 things at this point. The first thing to say is that in the assignment on Edmodo, there's actually a link to the playlist with all of these pieces, because it's important that you can identify and recognize these different genres. So the sonata, quartet, concerto, and symphony, because you're going to be tested on these at the end of a lesson with different pieces of music. The other thing, which is a little bit evil, and the reason I've written the word coffee, is because in the test I've got a trick question to make sure that you have watched the video. And in my head, the question is, which brand of coffee is Mr. Morris's favourite? The answer is Caffè Nero. So I'm going to give you the spelling now for later. Caffè, spelled C-A-F-E. Nero, N-E-R-O. So that's going to be your secret answer later. Do not share this with the rest of the class. But again, if you need to go over and listen to even a few seconds of each example, you can do that by clicking on the link in the assignment on Edmodo. Okay, oh, that's a bit trippy. I don't like that. So, some key musical characteristics for the classical period, and it's important to get these down because these could be given in an exam. So I'm just going to run these off here, but the one in red there isn't really an exam answer, but it's something to be aware of in terms of the style. Okay, so the first 2 points here is the idea of using antecedent and consequent phrases. All that means is question, antecedent, and answer, which we've been talking about a lot. So you might have a two-bar question and a 2-bar answer. Another way of looking at this is just regular phrasing. Some other things to just be clear about. This idea of simple diatonic harmony, which is a reason for Baroque music as well. There's some similarities here. And I do want to make sure that we're okay with this idea of Alberti bass. So I'm just going to go over to Focus on Sound, which you have access to, and I've just typed in Alberti into the dictionary, and it gives me an example here. So it's the type of accompaniment where if we've got a major chord, if we've got, say, C major, which we've got here, you play the root, the fifth, the third, and the fifth, and you alternate that pattern. Let's just have a listen to this. Again, very famous piece, you might recognize it. You've got some more examples, so if you want to check that out, or any other term, obviously, come on to Focus on Sound with your username and password, and you'll be able to check this out. Okay, so just continuing with this, hopefully you've listed these things. If not, pause the video to do that before we just finish off with the last bit of this lesson. So just to finish, whilst we have our three kind of stellar composers in Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, like I said before, there are lots of other composers out there, and these are just 4 examples. Now, I don't know whether you would have seen the film Amadeus, which is, you know, it's fake, but it's a sort of story around Mozart's life. And this composer, Salieri, features quite a lot, and he's sort of portrayed as being the villain who ends up, you know, killing Mozart, basically, which I'm afraid to say isn't true, but it's a good story. Anyway, these 4 are also classical composers. So to really get your head in the style, I recommend listening to them. And lastly, so on Edmodo, what you should be doing after this is actually completing this quiz. So just to walk through, task 1 is this, it's watching this video. Task 2 is the playlist of music that I have played you so that you can really make sure you're happy with each of those genres. Task 3 is the quiz, and you need to click on that link, and you're being tested on those pieces of music. Right, if you've got any questions on this or comments, please send me a message, but I look forward to seeing some working from you, and of course seeing you back in school soon. Okay guys, take care.